Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. If everyone could make their way back to their seats, we want to get this thing started a couple minutes early so we can give time for our panel. Good morning and welcome to the State of the Economy. This is our inaugural event of the 2024 BOMA and NAIOP seasons. It is by far our most popular breakfast education event. So thank you to all of you. Since this is our most popular, I'll keep my comments short so we can get right to the panel. A huge thank you to all of our sponsors. As you can see on the board, we encourage you to reach out, support our sponsors, and especially to today's presenting sponsor, CBRE, for helping to put this panel together. My name is Nate Phillips. I serve as the president-elect of the NAIOP board. And on behalf of BOMA and NAIOP, thank you again for coming. A couple of quick announcements before we get started. We want to introduce Tom Frank as our new executive director. We're excited to have Tom here with us. Some chapter events for NAIOP. We've got the ski outing coming up, and of course, our awards banquet is in May. I'd encourage you to reach out to Tom, Erica, or go to the website for announcements on all of our great events. My job is to introduce Don Smith as today's moderator. Don is the president of RIDC. He has many years of service to not only NAIOP, but the Pittsburgh real estate community largely. He has served as a board member, as president, and perhaps most importantly, as a mentor to many of the people in this room, including myself. We are eternally grateful for Don's advocacy on economic development issues, both locally and regionally, and his representation of NAIOP Pittsburgh at the national level, at the NAIOP National Board, and his leadership today of this esteemed panel. So please welcome Don Smith.
Thank you, Nate, and good morning, everyone. It's great to see such a great turnout today on a chilly day in Pittsburgh. You know, as Nate said, this is usually our biggest event, and it's personally always my favorite event because my fellow colleagues, my economists, come and tell us what's going to happen in the economy. And so it's always a good time. Today, we're really lucky. We have two tremendous speakers here to entertain and inform and enlighten us this morning. And as part of the commercial real estate development industry, most of us here, we make big bets on the future. We make big bets, and when we're right, there are profits to be made. There are futures to be created. There are places to be made. And when we're wrong, money is lost, and the market really is a cruel taskmaster in enforcing good decision-making on those of us in the commercial real estate industry. Our speakers today share our concern with where the economy is headed because it's their job, it's their livelihood. And when they make their call, just like we make our calls on going forward with projects and things, they make their call. Millions, sometimes billions of dollars are influenced by what they say. So they feel our pain. We're all concerned with where the future is going. Fortunately, we have two incredible experts here today to share with us some thoughts on where that future might be headed and where the economy is going. And we're going to hear some about the macroeconomy and the national stage and city of Pittsburgh or region of Pittsburgh. We're also going to hear about what the factors that are most important to commercial real estate and some of the things that are driving some of that decision that we make. So first, we're going to hear from our old friend, Gus Faucher, who is the chief economist at PNC. And he's well known to basically all of us here at NAIOP Pittsburgh because he is essentially our resident prognosticator. So much like Punxsutawney Phil will be out next week, Pittsburgh Gus is going to share with us his thoughts on where the economy's headed. And then I'm just going to introduce both our speakers now. They'll come up serially, and then we'll do some Q&A afterwards. But today, thanks to our title sponsor, CBRE, we have a very special guest joining us today. And so we are going to be fortunate enough to have Spencer Levy here from CBRE. Spencer is a global client advisor. He's also the senior economic advisor, but he's really most well known for his appearances in the media, and he is frequently quoted on major business publications, on major shows, and he's also the host of CBRE's award-winning podcast, The Weekly Take, which is the most heavily downloaded podcast in all of commercial real estate. Big consumer market for commercial real estate because we are really popular, folks. But for those people who are in our industry, we have two of the best here to give us their thoughts about where the economy is headed and to give some advice and forecast for you to incorporate into your business decision making. So they're going to come up, they're going to speak, then we're going to have them sit down and we're going to do some Q&A. So think up those hard questions that you want to pose to our experts. And so please join me right now in welcoming Gus Faucher to the stage.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I've been doing this presentation. I was telling Nate that this is the first presentation I did when I joined PNC back in 2012. And I think that headshot is from 2012 because I have a lot more hair and it's a lot less gray in that picture. But thank you very much again for having me back. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. And where are my slides here? Okay. And so, while we're waiting for my slides to come up, I owe you an apology because when I spoke here last year, I said that we were likely to get a recession in 2023. That obviously did not happen. If anything, we saw economic growth accelerate in 2023. The labor market was stronger than we were expecting. The unemployment rate has been below 4% for almost 2 years now at this point. I would expect when we get the job numbers on Friday, it will be again under 4%, and that would be the longest such stretch since the late 1960s. So the economy is actually doing pretty well, and I owe you an apology for telling you last year that I thought we would be in recession at this point. I think that, one of the things that had me confused back in the fall, this is PNC Small Business Survey. We do this twice a year. The fall 2023 results were the strongest in the more than 20-year history of the survey. And I was a little surprised by that because there was a lot of concern about higher interest rates. There was a lot of concern about inflation. But I think our small business respondents were attuned to something, that we were seeing a strong second half of 2023, much stronger than we were expecting. And that is showing up in these numbers here, that you can see that 75% of small businesses were optimistic about their own company's prospects over the next 6 months. The spring 2024 survey is now out in the field. We haven't seen the results yet, but I'll be very interested to see what they're showing. But as of now, conditions look very good in the U.S. economy. And we've also seen a peak in interest rates. So when the pandemic hit in early 2020, we saw the Federal Reserve cut the Fed funds rate, their key short-term policy rate, basically down to zero. You can see that the yield on the 3-month Treasury bill, the blue line, fell to zero. And then the Fed said, we need to do more. We need to reduce long-term interest rates as well. So they started to buy mortgage-backed securities. They started to buy long-term treasuries. So we saw the yield on the 10-year Treasury fall below 1%. We saw the 30-year fixed rate mortgage fall to about 3%. And so we had historically low both short-term and long-term interest rates. But then the economy recovered, inflation started to pick up, the Fed started to reduce the size of its balance sheet. So first we saw long-term interest rates increase. And then starting just about 2 years ago, we saw the Fed start to increase the Fed funds rate, their short-term rate. And so we've seen both long-term and short-term rates increase dramatically over the past couple of years. And certainly that has people anxious. It's a lot more expensive to borrow to buy a home, to finance capital projects, to finance real estate investment. We have seen a little bit of a decline in long-term rates recently. And then the Fed stopped raising the Fed funds rate in the second half of 2023. So interest rates appear to have peaked, but they're certainly much higher than they've been for a couple of decades now at this point. And certainly that has people anxious and uneasy about the situation. We're also in a situation where the global economy is at risk of recession. We had weak GDP numbers for the Eurozone in the fourth quarter. We just got those today. This comes from my former employer, Moody's Analytics. You can see that most of the global economy, including the United States, is in that yellow at-risk category. What we've been experiencing in the U.S. with high inflation, central bank tightening monetary policy, that's occurring throughout the world. So we're seeing something similar going on in Canada, in the UK, in the Eurozone, in Australia. China, we were expecting China to be a big driver of global economic growth in 2023 as they ended their zero COVID policy, but their recovery has been weak. We have seen China undertake some stimulus measures recently, but I think it's fair to say that the global economy has not been much of a support to the U.S. economy in 2023, and I think that that's likely to remain the case in 2024, particularly as inflation remains high throughout much of the world and as policy rates remain high. That being said, we have experienced a very strong recovery in the U.S. labor market over the past few years. So with the pandemic, we saw employment in the United States fall by 22 million in March and April of 2020. To put that in context, during the Great Recession, we saw employment fall by about 8 million. So much larger job losses concentrated in a much shorter period of time. But look where we are now. We are basically back on track. If you continue that blue line, the trend, employment is basically back to where we would have expected it to be without the pandemic. We have seen a slowing in job growth over the course of 2023. That's actually a good thing. So at the beginning of last year, we were adding 300,000 jobs a month. At the end of last year, we were adding, 200,000, 175,000 jobs a month. That's still a little bit stronger than the Fed would like. It's still a little bit stronger than underlying growth in the labor force, but certainly we are seeing a balancing out in the labor market, and the slowing in job growth is good news from an inflation perspective. You can see that office using employment, in fact, is actually somewhat above its pre-pandemic trend. With the pandemic, with the changes that we have seen in the U.S. economy, there has been a shift away from some sectors of office using employment, particularly leisure, hospitality, services, into other industries. And so you can see that if anything, office using employment is above that long-term trend. Now, we did have some softness at the end of 2023. A lot of that occurred in what's called professional and business services, and in particular, it occurred in temporary help services. And that is not necessarily a big user of office space. It's included in that category. But, a lot of businesses, office using businesses use temporary workers, manufacturing, and so forth as a bridge. But certainly we have seen slower growth in office using employment in 2023, but certainly a very, very strong recovery there. And in fact, is about, 1.5 million above its pre-pandemic level. If we look at the broader economy, again, we've made a remarkable recovery. So these are three measures of economic activity. I set the peak before the pandemic equal to 100. These are adjusted for inflation. What you can see is that no matter how you look at it, the economy contracted by somewhere between 7 and 9% with the pandemic, between the fourth quarter of 2019 and the second quarter of 2020. But now the economy is about 8% larger than it was before the pandemic. Again, basically, if you continue that trend line, we are back on track. And that is very remarkable given the dislocation that we experienced And also, it's very good compared to the international experience. The U.S. recovery has been much more complete compared to most other nations, in large part because of more fiscal and monetary stimulus that we received here in the United States. That being said, the recovery has been uneven across different parts of the economy, and that has big implications for your industry. So consumer spending on services, education, healthcare, housing services, travel, tourism, those types of things. You can see, again, I set the peak before the pandemic equal to 100, adjusted for inflation. Consumer spending on services fell by about 15% initially, is now about 6 or 7% above its pre-pandemic level. On the other hand, look at consumer spending on goods. These are either durable goods, big ticket items like cars and appliances, or non-durable goods, food, clothing, medicine. That jumped with the pandemic. What happened? Well, we were all stuck at home. We weren't going out. And this was all the Amazon packages that were showing up on my doorstep every other day. But what you can see is that basically after a surge in goods spending, that it's been flat for the past 3 years. There are only so many goods that you can buy. At least that's what I tell my kids. And, we bought a lot of goods in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. And since then, goods spending has stabilized. So a couple of implications of this. First of all, this was a big contributor to the high inflation that we experienced because our economy wasn't set up to handle this level of goods demand. So we had shortages, we had price increases. Second thing is that as the economy continues to move forward, I expect that the most of the growth on the consumer side is going to come from services rather than goods. Services spending is not back to its pre-pandemic trend. Goods spending is above its pre-pandemic trend. And we expect that consumer spending growth will be concentrated in services going forward. Business fixed investment. This includes commercial construction. That fell by about 10% initially, is now about 11% above its pre-pandemic level, had a solid increase in the fourth quarter of 2023, I think in part because of lower interest rates. Some of this is tied to the various fiscal stimulus efforts we've had, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and so forth, but very solid recovery there. Residential investment. So this is single and multifamily home building, repairs and renovations. That soared in the second half of 2020 with very low mortgage rates. If you're, we were at home, our spouses were at home, our kids were at home. So we went out and bought a bigger house or put an addition on our house. But since then, as mortgage rates have increased, we've seen a big drop there. Now, the good news is you can see that decline appears to have ended. So with mortgage rates moving down a little bit, we're seeing the housing market. It's not that it's adding to growth, but it isn't a drag on growth anymore. And then finally, this is the key to the entire thing. After-tax personal income, the red line there. You can see, remember how I showed you how we lost those 22 million jobs? Yet at the same time, household income, this is income from the labor market, from government transfer payments, from investment returns, that jumped about 10% because the federal government stepped in, and provided assistance to households and to businesses. And then we had another spike up in 2021 with the additional stimulus payments. But that's what allowed people to go out and buy a new car or put an addition on their home or put a down payment down on a new home. Now you can see that after the expiration of those stimulus payments, that after-tax income declined. But more recently, as inflation has slowed, as job growth has been solid, as wage growth has been good, we have seen after-tax income increase. And that's very good because that's the key driver of consumer spending, which makes up about 2/3 of the U.S. economy. On the inflation front, as I mentioned, we had very strong goods demand. This is the New York Fed's Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. So this looks at things like shipping times and shipping costs, purchasing manager surveys, and so forth. The long-run value is set equal to 0. You can see that we had incredibly high shipping pressures, supply chain pressures in 2021, 2022, but now they're actually below their long-run average, and that has big implications for the inflation outlook. So this is various measures of inflation, the percent change from 1 year ago. Energy inflation. So energy prices surged in the recovery from the pandemic and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They've come down. They're down over the past year or so, not back to where they were before the pandemic, but certainly lower than they were a year ago. So good news on inflation there. Food and beverage inflation, the black line. I do the grocery shopping in our household. And, a year ago, year and a half ago, every time I went to the grocery store, it seemed like it cost $3 or $4 more to do the weekly grocery shopping. But I've noticed that that's not the case anymore. Prices are stabilizing. And we're seeing that in the inflation numbers for food and beverage. Still a little high, but certainly much better than we were a year or so ago. Core goods, goods excluding food and energy. Basically, over the past year, we've seen zero inflation there, back to the pre-pandemic trend. And that's, again, because of the easing of those supply chain pressures and the fact that goods demand has basically been flat over the past few years. So you look at these three lines and you're like, okay, what's the problem with inflation? Well, here's the problem with inflation. This blue line, core services, which is services excluding energy services. And what you can see is that accelerated in 2021, 2022, slowed a little bit in 2023, but is still well above its pre-pandemic trend. This is things like education, healthcare, travel and tourism, housing services, those types of things. So this is elevated. And this is why the Federal Reserve is still concerned about high inflation as we enter 2024. And the Fed is particularly concerned about the strength of the labor market. If you think about service industries, what's their chief input? It's labor. So if labor costs are going up, services prices are going up. The orange line on the right-hand scale is average wages in the U.S. economy, growth, year-over-year growth. The blue line is the Fed's preferred inflation measure, the core PCE price index. And what you can see is that a lot of this inflation is driven by wages, and that we have had strong wage growth above the pre-pandemic trend and strong inflation. So the Fed would like to see wage growth slow to closer to something around 3.5% or so. That would be consistent with the Fed's 2% inflation objective over the longer run. So the Fed wants to see a bit more slack in the labor market that would result in slower wage growth, wages still growing faster than inflation, but a bit slower wage growth and reduce those inflationary pressures in the U.S. economy. And so, for example, we've seen the Fed reducing the size of its balance sheet. So when the pandemic hit, the Fed started to buy long-term treasuries, the orange bars, mortgage-backed securities, the blue bars. That pushed down long-term interest rates in the U.S. economy. But with the recovery with high inflation, the Fed has let those securities mature and roll off its balance sheet. And that's put upward pressure on long-term interest rates, which are obviously very important for your industry. And the Fed continues to reduce the size of its balance sheet in 2024. And that is, again, putting upward pressure on long-term interest rates. So even with higher rates, even with tight monetary policy, I still expect that the U.S. economy is going to grow in 2024 for a few reasons. The first of which is the labor market is very strong. So this is the labor force participation rate, the share of adults who are either working or looking for work. First of all, you can see the long run decline with the retirement of the baby boomers, but it is below its pre-pandemic level, both in the United States and especially in Pennsylvania. And so this means that it is tough to find workers out there. So even if we do see a slowing in economic growth, businesses will be reluctant to lay workers off because they're going to be concerned about the ability to find workers once the economy starts to pick up again. So the strength of the labor market is one key reason for economic resilience in 2024. Second key reason is that consumers are generally in good shape. The blue line on the left-hand scale is the personal saving rate, the share of after-tax income that households save. You can see that that spiked up with the stimulus payments that we had in 2020 and 2021 and limited opportunities to spend. It's fallen since then. It's below its long run average, still higher than it was heading into the Great Recession. So households still have some savings left over from 2020 and 2021. So they will need to increase their savings rate, but they do have a bit of a cushion there. And then the orange line on the right-hand scale, that's the financial obligations ratio. That's the share of after-tax income that goes to mortgage payments, rents for renters, homeowners insurance, property taxes, all those kinds of things. You hear a lot of doom and gloom out there about consumer debt burdens. You know, they're at record highs. Well, you know what else is at record highs? Jobs, wages, incomes, all of that stuff. So when you look at those consumer debt burdens relative to incomes, they're actually very good on a historical basis. So consumer debt is low relative to incomes, and so consumers do not need to cut back on their debt, and that will support spending growth going forward. And then a third reason is that with the downturn in the housing market, that's likely come to an end with mortgage rates moving down. So the orange line on the right-hand scale is existing single-family home sales. The blue line on the left-hand scale is a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. Obviously, with higher mortgage rates, it became much more expensive to buy a home, particularly with the increase in prices that we've seen, but mortgage rates have come down. We appear to be reaching a bottom in existing single-family home sales. Inventories are still tight out there, but lower mortgage rates should provide some support to the housing market. And structurally, the housing market is strong. So this is single-family home starts. You can see that for the past 15 years, they were well below their pace back in the 1990s and the early part of this century. If anything, we've underbuilt single-family homes over the past 15, 20 years or so. And so for those of you who are in multifamily, I know a lot of multifamily as supply has come on the market lately, that rent growth has slowed, but generally I think that conditions will favor multifamily over the longer run, given the low level of single family home building that we've had for the past 15 years. So so those are reasons for optimism about the economy. But the truth is the yield curve is still inverted. We still have short-term rates that are above long-term rates. So this line, which measures the difference between the 10-year Treasury yield and the 3-month Treasury yield, is below the axis. Those gray bars are recessions, and typically when the yield curve inverts, we get a recession. We've had a deep inversion in the yield curve for an extended period of time. That was a big reason why I was expecting to get a recession in 2023, but that signal hasn't been borne out yet. That being said, you know, I think that there's still a pretty decent probability, around 40%, that we do get a recession over the next 18 months or so. But we have moved away from a recession forecast towards a weak growth forecast for 2024. Now, that being said, this is our January forecast. This still shows a mild recession. Our February forecast will show weak growth. But I think what we will see is slower economic growth in 2024. So somewhere between 1 and 1.5%, down from about 3% in 2023. The unemployment rate, which was at 3.7%, I think we see it increase to a little bit north of 4% by the end of 2024, the beginning of 2025, but that's still very low on a historical basis. So again, our updated forecast for February will show weak growth, but not a recession in 2024. But there are a lot of risks out there, and in particular, I'm concerned about the potential for a wider war in the Middle East that would raise inflationary pressures in the U.S., that would cause the Fed to tighten more aggressively. And then I'm also concerned about what's going on in commercial real estate markets. In the office market in particular, there's a lot of vacancies out there. I think that and I'm hoping to hear from Spencer on this, but I think, a lot of concern about valuations in the office market. So a lot of and the exposure of the financial system to it. I think the banking system probably is okay, but the non-bank lending to commercial real estate, to the office market, is a concern, and that fallout could be greater than we're expecting. Let's talk briefly about regional economic conditions. This is the Philadelphia Fed's coincident index at the end of 2023, you can see the conditions are mixed. So Pennsylvania, we have kind of soft growth. A lot of the industrial heartland is tied to manufacturing that's interest rate sensitive. So some softness there, but you look in the West, parts of the Southeast, they continue to see strong population inflows and solid growth there. This is employment. I set employment in February of 2020, right before the pandemic, equal to 100. What you can see is that we had larger job losses in the Pittsburgh metro area than in the rest of the country. But more importantly, employment in the Pittsburgh metro area is not back to its pre-pandemic level. It is still about 1.5% lower than it was before the pandemic. That is not the case for Pennsylvania and for the nation as a whole. Employment is above its pre-pandemic level. And that's because the Pittsburgh labor force is smaller than it was before the pandemic. It's down by about 45,000. We have seen people drop out of the labor force here. We have an older population. It's a question of labor supply, not labor demand in Pittsburgh. We just have an older population and a smaller labor force than we did before the pandemic. Okay. Just quickly, Pittsburgh is less exposed to the housing cycle than other parts of the country. So price increases in the Pittsburgh metro area were not as significant during the recovery from the pandemic as they were in the United States. Housing affordability is very good relative to the incomes in Pittsburgh, much better than it is in the rest of the United States. And I show this every year, but this is the most important chart for you. Population. Population in the Pittsburgh metropolitan area, that's the 7 counties, is falling. And it's growing more slowly in the U.S. and Pennsylvania, actually down over the past couple of years in Pennsylvania. But this means weaker demand for housing, weaker demand for retail services, all of those types of things. And over the long run, it's difficult to keep up if your population is falling. You just don't have the labor supply out there. You don't have the demand in consumer industries. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you, Gus, for that really cornucopia of information about our economy. Before I call Spencer up, or while we're loading his slides, I did want to recognize we do have some elected officials who've joined us today in the crowd. State Senator Jay Costa just actually, there he is. There's State Senator Jay Costa, State Senator Devlin Robinson, and of course, County Executive Sarah Inamorata. We thank you for all you do for our region. And with that, please join me in welcoming Spencer Levy to the stage.
For all my friends in here in real estate, you know there's a lot of bad news out there right now. Lenders aren't lending, hard to find value, and Kenny Pickett is not Dan Marino. But I think notwithstanding the bad news as you know it, I think you got to break it into 2 categories. You got to break it into the capital markets and the fundamentals. Because the capital markets are well known. Because interest rates went up by 300 basis points at both ends of the curve. Cap rates went up by 200-300 basis points, depending upon your asset class. Hard to finance assets, hard to sell them. We know that. Here's the good news. Fundamentals, with the exception of Class B commodity office, for the most part, are very good. Are they softening? Yeah. They're softening in industrial. They're softening in multifamily. But some of the areas that would normally be really soft are actually performing at historically great levels. And that includes retail and hotels. And you know why? 2 acronyms, which I did not know before the COVID crisis: FOMO and YOLO. And that's why when I stayed, it must have been the world's nicest courtyard by Marriott in New York City the other day, I paid $1,000 a night, and I had to pay for my own coffee. But the point is that consumer sentiment, as described by Gus before, has been exceptionally strong, and it's driving some of these consumer-oriented parts of the economy. Those areas that are not consumer driven, that are driven by business decisions. And just so you know, economics 101, 2/3 of the economy is the consumer. 1/6 is business, 1/6 is the government. More or less, right, Gus? Thank you, Gus. Gus and I both went to Cornell, so we're in cahoots. The bottom line is all the business spending has slowed much faster than has the consumer, and that's impacted industrial. So industrial at peak demand had about 50 million square feet of demand. Last year was 200 million. This year might be 250. Now, the good news is that building is much slower than I think even Gus suggested on his slide. It's much slower because if you have a blue chip builder today that was borrowing at 65% loan to value at 5.5% 3 years ago, that blue chip builder is lucky to get 50% at 10% today. That's how pricing has changed. And so if there's a silver lining in the rise in interest rates, it's that new supply has dropped off a cliff. It's dropped off a cliff in industrial. It's dropped off a cliff in multifamily. And multifamily, by the way, and I agree with Gus's comment, is probably the single biggest challenge we have nationally. If I could magically get 5 million new units and just plop it down right now in the United States, we'd still have a shortage. And why do we have a shortage? We have a shortage not just because of the cost of capital. We have a shortage because it's hard to build. And I was just in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, what's known as the Real Estate Roundtable, and I appreciate our elected officials being here. I was in front of the federal elected officials. I think if there's any piece of good news coming out of Washington, and sometimes it's hard to find if you haven't noticed, the good news is both the right and the left agree that affordable housing is the number one problem we're facing. We can deal with it. And they're giving all kinds of federal incentives to do it. And so I tell my clients, many of whom buy multifamily, many of my clients say, oh, we're only going to do the Class A stuff. I tell them to go all the way down the quality spectrum to Capital A affordable, which is government regulated LIHTC housing, because it's more stable. Did you know that the average tenant rolls over at 60% at the most high quality stuff? And when you go down the quality spectrum, it's 5% turnover. And it's inflation adjusted if it's Capital A. So look into Capital A affordable housing. So what's our outlook for commercial real estate overall if we've got this really difficult capital markets environment and fundamentals aren't so bad? But first, I'm going to ask a couple questions of the audience here. Got any appraisers in the room here today? Anybody in the appraisal business? No appraisers? Okay. Well, next time you see an appraiser, do me a favor. Give that person a hug. You know why? They never get any love at these things. It's always the fancy developer that build the big shiny building. Because without the appraisers, we'd be in a lot worse shape than we are right now. And why is that? It's because the banks' balance sheets are clogged with a bunch of office loans today that are worth a lot less than they're valuing if they were to liquidate today. But appraisers, because of the MAI process, are slowly ratcheting it down so they can have a soft landing in the bank. And by the way, our forecast overall is soft landing. By the way, you know why it's easy for me to say soft landing? Because you all want me to say soft landing, right? I could get up here and be much more negative. And you say, I just had breakfast. But we believe that. And a lot of the risk factors that Gus just laid out a moment ago, and there's a parade of horribles, I can come up with an even longer list. We've been studying geopolitical events. We've been studying presidential elections going back 60 years. And notwithstanding the social issues, which I'm not going to talk about, from an economic perspective, it doesn't matter that much. And so ultimately, yes, there's enormous risk factors out there, but I think the actions of the central bank here, the central banks in Europe and elsewhere, are going to have much greater impact on our business. So from real estate, what do we look at? So first of all, to all my real estate friends in this room, which is all of you. By the way, Mamdi, my colleague sitting right there, we went to the same tailor. Did you notice that? That's teamwork right there. That's teamwork. But, the bottom line is I got bad news for everybody in this room. You are not in the real estate business. You are in the labor and finance business. And real estate is simply a derivative. And you learned that on the finance side last year when you couldn't sell anything and couldn't finance anything. And on the labor side, most important slide that Gus showed up there was the labor force here in the Berg. And the labor force in the Berg may be shrinking. Okay, but you got to you got to go behind the headlines here. You know where the labor force is getting a lot better here in the Berg? The quality of your labor force. And I know this because we come out with a study every year, and Pittsburgh keeps moving up on our tech talent list because of Carnegie Mellon University, because of Pitt. And there's certain neighborhoods that are thriving because of that. Bakery Square right here in the Berg, doing very well. And that is the key point of all. A lot of people say, oh, that's a little voice that comes out of me once in a while. But what you need to see is the quality of the workforce that's staying here or moving here that is going to determine not just the future of the Berg, but the future of real estate in the Berg. Because ultimately, what we're seeing now is a move away from markets to sub-markets. I don't like any market in the United States. I like a lot of sub-markets. I like Bakery Square up there. In Columbus, Ohio, I like the street, the short north from the hockey arena to the Ohio State University. And yes, I'm wearing an M up here, but I teach at Ohio State, so they deserve some love too. The point is, if you can find labor coming into the market of that high quality nature, surround it with other forms of real estate. And what do I mean by that? So it was mentioned briefly the CHIPS Act. Now, when I was in Columbus, Ohio the other day, I visited this little town next to Columbus called New Albany. And what was in New Albany? New Albany was the new Intel plant. How did it get there? The CHIPS Act. By the way, before I go on any further, you guys remember the TV show CHIPS? You remember that show? Can anybody here name the characters in the show? Ponch and John. Very good. Well done. Can you name the actors? Okay, who's the other guy? Everybody gets Eric Estrada. Wilcox, you see that? Took an economist to get the right answer. So, funny story about that. So I was in Boise, Idaho the other day. Actually, I went to 3 visits and we saw each other there. And who was I hanging out with the other day? I was hanging out with Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House, vice presidential candidate. And I really like Paul for 2 reasons. One reason is he's exactly the same age as me. So that meant he got all of my ridiculous questions right. So folks, for anybody under the age of 40, you're going to hate this question. So for people around my vintage, on Saturday nights when you were a kid, you used to watch The Love Boat, right? And then you watched not a setup, folks. Not a setup. But the other reason I liked Paul Ryan was because he's actually friends with Jerome Powell. And I think what if Gus and I were to agree on any one thing other than Big Red doesn't have a great football team, we'd both agree that the single most important thing that's going to happen in our economy or not this year is how much and how fast interest rates are going down. Do we agree on that? Okay, Gus gave me a kind of Mets. All right, well, we're going to go with it anyways. So I asked him, well, are interest rates going to go down this year? He goes, well, one thing you should know about Jerome Powell is Jerome, or Jay as he's known to his friends, is not an economist. Jerome is a lawyer, just like me. So there's hope for us all. But what that means is he is a politician. And I love politicians. This is no disrespect. It's just he's going to look at the tea leaves beyond just the data. He's like, we are data driven. Doesn't get good, we're not going to do anything. Well, guess what's happening in 2024? A presidential election, right? Is that going to influence them? Well, you guys folks remember the slogan from 1992 from James Carville? It's the economy, stupid. Do you think he wants to get caught in that little trap? I don't think so either. So I think he has pressure to put rates down faster than even we're forecasting, and we're forecasting rates to go down 4 times this year. But you should know that is, from a real estate perspective, maybe not the overall economy, Gus, is by far the most important question. By far. We are by far the most interest rate sensitive industry. And so here's our forecast on the one number that matters, which is interest rates. And we think the short end of the curve will end this year around 4%. We think it'll end next year around 3.5% and end in that following year around 2.5%. What does that mean? Okay, we're going to be in a long, slow, and slightly improving environment. But 2 years from now, you're going to have lower cap rates than you have before. What does that mean? And this is a comment that got me tossed from my room once. It means that when you look at your exit, you may want to be flat or negative on your exit cap rate from a capital perspective. Didn't get me tossed out of the Berg, did it? No, didn't happen. What I'm saying is things are going to get a lot better in a couple of years, but it's going to be a long slog, probably seeing more material improvement by the end of this year. But don't be surprised if Jerome Powell or Jay Powell is influenced not just by the data, but by some of the broader forces in the presidential election coming up. So I'm going to sum up my comments here because I want to take questions. Commercial real estate world is a tale of two worlds. It's a tale of fundamentals and the capital markets. Fundamentals, quite good, but weakening. Capital markets, bad and getting better. And when will the two merge? Probably by the end of this year, things will be better. Next year, things will be a lot better from both a deal volume standpoint, fundamentals improving, people building again, and Pittsburgh will have a better quarterback under center. Thank you very much, and let's go.
Well, thank you very much, Spencer. Boy, you two guys really do disservice to the title of the dismal science for economists. You've really given us some great food for thought and some real energy and interesting things going on. I'm going to start with two questions, and then we're going to go to the crowd for questions. So start thinking up those zingers. The first is, so you both alluded to the fact that there's this big overhang in financing. I'm old enough to have lived through the savings and loan crisis, the 2009 bailout. Are we looking and heading for some sort of bailout for the financial industry sector to solve some of those short-term problems with liquidity?
Well, let me answer that question. It comes straight out of the roundtable. Okay, I'm kind of a gadfly there. I'm the guy who always recommends like the ridiculous ideas. And my ridiculous idea in front of Washington, and I've been doing it for 18 months now, is to do a TARP or TALF type solution to pull the bad loans out of the banks and put them on a side pocket and reliquify the banks. That's not going to happen, okay? And it's not going to happen because there's no political appetite in Washington, D.C. to bail out rich developers. That's the way they see the world, right? So that's not going to happen. But the way that the economy gets reliquefied is going to be from a fire sale. Not a fire sale like we saw in the RTC days. By the way, I'd rather see a fire sale because the RTC days, for people who don't remember the early 1990s, is when instead of the current strategy, which is to protect the banks at all costs, the strategy there was to take them over and liquidate them immediately. It was a much more pure capitalistic way of doing it, and the market recovered very quickly. But now we're just going to see a slow bleed of assets coming out. And what does that look like? So here comes the good news and a little bit of doom and gloom. I mean, the good news is the best assets and the best submarkets are trading about 25 to 30% below where they were at peak. The worst assets, a lot worse. When I say a lot worse, we just traded an asset in Charlotte that we valued at $160 million a few years ago. We traded it for 18 million bucks. Okay, so that's the kind of value destruction you're seeing in the office sector. If it's an older building, under tenanted, needs capex. And so we need to see some of those assets clear out of the market. We need to see them in new hands with capital. I don't think you're going to see a lot of them converted because it costs too much.
So I think that generally the financial system is in good shape. And let me preface this by saying that I'm talking about the banking system in general and not PNC specifically. When you look at capital levels, they're much higher than they were back in 2007, 2008, in large part because of the Dodd-Frank reforms that required banks to hold more capital. If you look at delinquency rates, they're extremely low right now, whether you're looking at consumer loans, mortgage loans, C&I loans, even CRE loans, delinquency rates are low there. Now, there is going to be refinancing taking place at higher rates in lower property values on the office side, and that's going to cause some dislocation. But generally, I think that the financial system is well capitalized, that we will see some banks that run into trouble, but I think that overall the banking system is doing pretty well. And I think last year when we had the problems at Silicon Valley and First Republic, those problems were specific to those banks. They had bad loans, yes, but they also had very high shares of uninsured deposits and that was really the cause of their problem. And so we also saw the FDIC and the Fed step in aggressively to support the banking system. So I see idiosyncratic specific problems at specific financial institutions. I don't see systemic wide problems. And then, sorry, and I should have said this earlier, but I agree with Spencer. I do expect that we will see the Fed cut 4 times this year, 25 basis points each time. And, that again, that's going to provide some support to borrowers. And so that should help alleviate some of those concerns in the financial system.
Thank you. You referred to this conversion movement. Everybody wants to convert, and Pittsburgh is certainly focused on how do we convert these downtown office properties to residential. Is that a good strategy, particularly given that you said about the costs, and also if you expect the economy to be significantly better for real estate in 2 years or 3 years? Do we bite the bullet and convert now, or what are the best strategies for thinking about that?
Well, first of all, I'm going to take it out of side pocket, and then I'm going to come right back to the question. So on the Weekly Take, the podcast that I host, and I can't believe it took me 49 minutes to shamelessly plug the show. We talked the other day about, I had Diana Olick on my show. Diana is the chief correspondent for CNBC on real estate, and she covers both the climate beat and real estate beat. What's relevant there is this. Today, the way sustainability works, and that's the word most people use today instead of ESG, sustainability. The way you get high scores there is by measuring your use of water, electricity, all that stuff. You know where you get no value? The embedded carbon in your building. None. And that's why you're seeing people demolish buildings and build a more efficient. Say, look at me, I'm green. I just knocked down that building and put up a greener one. Do you know how much carbon you just threw into the atmosphere by the steel and the bricks and everything else? Like, oh, you got no value. Well, Peter Drucker said, if it isn't countable, it doesn't count. And that's where we are today with the existing structures. So we need to change the rules of the game to give people a lot more benefit for that. So that's the side note. But here's the direct note on conversion. So yes, on the Weekly Take, we had another converter on the building, and they convert a lot in the Midwest. Okay, you may not think you're in the Midwest, but we'll draw a circle around you. You're kind of there. They need to buy buildings $50 a foot or less to have the prayer of being able to do it, because the cost is so high. So we do have a few elected officials in the room today. So this is not directed at you, but this is what I tell all elected officials. I don't want your money. I don't want any tax breaks. I don't want direct transfers. You know what I want? I want my time. And I want certainty when I permit the building to be able to convert. And that's what works. Everything else is a pipe dream, because the cost is just, there's not enough money in the world to do it. But if I know I can convert this building in 6 months, I'm going to make that bet. If I think it's going to be a 4-year slog, forget it. And you know who's doing it? Calgary did it. They've reduced their permitting time from 3 years to 6 months. You know who else is doing it? Florida. The Live Local Act. If you decide to convert a building, you put 20% affordable in there, 6 months. That's what's going to make the difference. And so hopefully we can get there here in Pittsburgh.
Just for those of you who know me, I swear I did not pay him to say permitting was the number one thing that we need to fix in order to get our economy moving again. But this is a rare opportunity to ask questions of our experts. Are there questions out there in the crowd that people would like to ask? Nate, we'll give you the first shot.
Can you expand on where you see construction costs going? Oh, that's okay. Could you expand on where you see construction costs going? Labor is still high. Material costs still seem to be high despite energy prices coming down some. And is that going to be putting the brakes on any of the economic tailwinds that you forecasted?
Well, construction costs are 3 elements. It's the cost of interest, cost of labor, and the cost of materials. And the cost of materials has come down. Some certain raw materials, wood, oil derivatives, those types of things. And the other thing that's come down now, and this is unfortunate for existing owners, is price of land. That's the only other thing that can move. So the price of land, which had been very sticky for a while, has finally really come down. So that's helped. But the price of labor, there's a concept that Gus and I would agree on. It's called sticky prices downward. Very hard to reduce the price of labor. So you're unlikely to see labor relief anytime soon. You'll see it at the margins. You'll see some subcontractors seeing that their pipeline is drying up and they'll bid lower. But the areas you're going to see most relief is in interest rates. And interest rates right now for even the best of the best contractors is double what it was pre-COVID, and you're getting it at much lower LTV. So you're going to get relief on interest rates, materials, land cost. Labor is going to be sticky high indefinitely. Gus,
Hey, nothing to add.
see that big
Okay.
red mojo?
Yes,
We're all
sir.
together here.
Oh, right there. Yes.
I don't want to go back too far, but Gus was talking about the labor market and the growth in the employment. Why is it that it seems like every quarter the adjustment is significant between the reported growth in jobs and the actual growth later? I believe last year there was an adjustment of 465,000 jobs down. Is that a significant thing, or is that just the way it's always been and always will be?
So we've always had revisions to the employment data that the Bureau of Labor Statistics goes back. So when we get the jobs report for January, they'll actually revise employment in November and December as well. And then they also do an annual adjustment. They use unemployment insurance forms, which are more complete, to give a full revision for the year. We have seen lower response rates among businesses since the pandemic. And so that's resulted in larger revisions. But these revisions, I mean, they're a little bit bigger than what we've seen previously, but they don't seem to be too far out of the norm with me, to me. And also, I think that the underlying story is still the same, which was that job growth was extremely strong coming out of the pandemic. The job growth was very good in 2022, slowed in 2023, but we still see employment growth that is above the economy's long-term potential and is perhaps a bit too strong for the Federal Reserve. And I don't expect that underlying story is going to change much, even with revisions.
Can I go on one other thing? So when I was in Washington last Tuesday, the other major issue that came up is immigration. We only got two solutions here, folks. We have a higher birth rate and we fell below replacement. We went to 1.8, we need 2.1, and we need more immigration. And the immigration, I'm not going to go into the politics of unskilled versus skilled, but if we don't have that, the labor force is never going to get bigger. This year is called peak 65. Anybody here turning 65 today? Anybody this year? The point is that the economy, for all the people out there who says, oh yeah, I put my money into Social Security, that's rock solid. Wrong answer. You know how it works? The young folks pay for the old folks. And if you don't have enough young folks, you got a problem. So on the labor question, I'm going to go apolitical here, but if we don't solve that, we've got a big problem going forward. And unfortunately, it's the biggest political hot potato out there.
Thank you. Back there.
This is maybe a little broader question, but consumer credit, the consumer drives the economy. Is there a bubble coming?
No. I showed that chart. If you look at consumer debt burdens relative to incomes, near a record low. I write a monthly column for the Post-Gazette. I think it was in July or August I went into this issue. Of all the things that keep me up at night, that is at the bottom of the list.
Okay. Another question back there.
Yeah, this is for Gus. Just wondering, related to employment in Pittsburgh. I think former County Executive Rich Fitzgerald had always quoted that Pittsburgh is holding its own in the age of 25 to 34, that demographic. Just wanted to get your thoughts on that, how much weight it carries and what it might look like moving forward.
Yeah, and in fact, I did an event yesterday for the Economic Club of Pittsburgh, and Chris Bream, who's a regional economist at Pitt, was there, and he talked about this issue. We're seeing some labor force growth among younger people, so people in that 20 to 30, 35-year-old category. The big area where Pittsburgh has problems is people who are roughly my age. So, between the mid 30s and
29.
mid 30s, 60, 65, that kind of thing. And that's an outgrowth of the big population outflows that the area saw in the 1980s. And the people who would have been, young adults growing up at that time, they moved away with their parents and they haven't come back. So we are doing a little bit better among young people. Obviously, we have our very good colleges and universities here. The tech industries do attract some of those young people, but it's kind of in that middle category, what we call prime age workers, where we fall short.
So prime age is another name for Gen X, and there's a few Gen Xers in this room, including myself. And who names these generations, by the way? I mean, the greatest generation is, did they name themselves? So from now on, anybody that's Gen X, you are now the awesome generation, because we're allowed to name ourselves too.
So you both alluded to sort of Pittsburgh's rise in sort of high quality talent, the highly educated workforce and some younger workers. So as an industry, as a real estate industry, and as a region, how do we capitalize on that? Where do we invest to take advantage of that?
If I had $1, first of all, the one area that Pittsburgh, unfortunately, US Air went out of business 25 years ago, but the one area that Pittsburgh has a huge competitive advantage is your airport. You actually have a very big airport that could expand. Most cities like this that I go to, I say, your airport is no bueno. Pittsburgh's got a oversupply of slots at its airport. Huge advantage, huge. So you've already got infrastructure. But the other thing is, if I had every dollar I have, I would throw 100% of it into Pitt, Carnegie Mellon, and all the universities here, all of it, and do everything you can to upgrade the quality so that not only you attract smart people, but you keep all the smart people from Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania in state.
And I would completely agree with that, and I'd also agree with Spencer's other point about immigration reform. I think an area like Pittsburgh really stands to benefit from increased flows of legal immigration, and we need to fix that at a national level. But then figure out, Pittsburgh historically. I mean, you think about the steel industry. Pittsburgh was built on immigration. We've gotten away from that, but we need to think about ways to attract immigrant flows that bring in capital, that bring in knowledge, that bring in entrepreneurship. And that's a way to build a foundation over the longer run.
Thank you. Question over here.
In the media, we hear a lot about the trillions and trillions of dollars of deficits. So, Gus, I'm not going to ask my recession question I normally ask, because you both have answered that. But is that a problem? And if not, when does it become a problem?
My kids are in their 20s. My oldest just turned 30 a few months ago. I do not think that government debt is going to be a problem during their lifetimes. Interest rates are lower now than they were in the past, structurally lower. And just as lower interest rates make it easy for businesses to carry debt, make it easier for households to carry debt, lower interest rates make it easier for the government to carry debt. And so I think that with structurally lower interest rates, that's not a concern. The debt to GDP ratio is, it's around 100% now. That's up from before the pandemic. But, the federal government can borrow for 10 years at 4%. Financial markets don't appear too concerned that they're not going to get their money back. Now, we need to make smart decisions. Spencer talked about Social Security. We need to think about Medicare. Those are going to be the big funding issues over the longer run. We need to make smart decisions. If we had immigration reform, that would help boost our tax base. But I'm just, again, that's not one of the things that keeps me up at night. And also, we continue to see foreign investors wanting to buy U.S. government debt because they view it as the safest asset in the world. And I think that's a big plus for the U.S. economy over the longer run.
Don, do we have time for questions?
Yeah, we have time for it.
I just have a question as it relates to the multifamily and the opportunity there. And where do you see the rental rate market, though, in terms of the consumer spending? Has it flattened? Do you still see the rental rate going up? Where do you see that at?
So rents in the Class A segment of multifamily have flattened and have started to decline in most of America today. Okay, it's flattened. Concessions have begun to go up, but I consider that to be a short-term problem because, as Gus pointed out correctly, we have a tremendous undersupply. But for my clients who either buy or build, I recommend now that they go all the way down the quality spectrum of not just Class A, look at workforce, look at capital A, look at manufactured, because the tenants get stickier and stickier and stickier, meaning they don't turn over. And we also see if capital A, you're inflation adjusted. So I think in the short term, for people that own multifamily, you should underwrite flat to negative growth of rent in 2024. Okay, that's where it is. But I think 2025, it starts to pop up again to its historic mean. And in fact, because we've had a tremendous undersupply of new build, you're going to probably grow above trend in 25, 26.
Thank you. Another question over here.
Yep. Thank you. Don Obermeyer with CESO. Just real quick question with the cap rates, the uncertainty over the past few years, there's definitely been some pullback from different market sectors. How do you guys see the different sectors like retail, hospitality, industrial, senior, residential, obviously office? Which ones would be the first ones to recover, get back to the gate? And then another follow-up question, Gus, you keep saying what doesn't keep you up at night? What does keep you up at night?
I'll take the sector one first, and then we'll have Gus talk about the parade of horribles that can hit the earth. I get it wrong a lot. Okay. I got it wrong just like Gus did last year on predicting the economy. And the reason I got it wrong last year was because the government came in and protected the banks more than I thought they would. And if they didn't protect the banks, we would have had that recession we were all working. But where I got it right, 5 years ago, I said open air retail was the most undervalued asset class in real estate. And the reason why it was undervalued, we weren't building anymore. And every institution on the planet was scared to death of it because they got crushed in the prior decade. So retail is the obvious answer for me. But here's the story. I just gave the absolute, horror story about office. I have a funny story, which I'll tell in 30 seconds. Do you remember that period of time from March through June of 2020 in COVID, where there was no professional sports on TV? Remember that? Mm-hmm. You know what was on TV? Horse racing. You know how many horse races I had watched in my life until then? 0. And then I got into it and I was like, well, what's this thing all about? And the beauty of it is the best data set I've ever seen. And there's probably 1,000 PhD level articles written on it. And they all come to one conclusion. The favorite is always materially overbet, and the underdog is always materially underbet. It's a psychological thing. What does that remind you of? Commercial real estate. What was overbought last year? Nothing personal, because I know there's some in this market. Life sciences. And I called that last year. I said, this is seriously overbought. What is seriously oversold right now is good office and good submarkets. And so one of my clients just bought a building in Midtown Atlanta at a 12 cap and has an 8-year weighted average lease term on it. We'll get 100% of his money out in 7 years and start again, right? So I would say the best opportunity right now is go to the best submarkets, find the best office building or retail, and get that. But I think over the long term, I want to be in the housing business because the housing business is the most undersupplied over a long-term basis.
So what keeps me up at night? I think one thing is geopolitical concerns. So an extended war in the Middle East that drives up oil prices, and that not only means more inflationary pressures in the U.S. economy, and perhaps the Fed needs to raise again. But if you're spending more on gasoline, that means consumers are cutting back in other areas. So that would be a significant drag on consumer spending. So that's one thing. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan disrupt supply chains, chips production. We saw the impact of that a couple of years ago. Certainly that's something that has me concerned. And then I am concerned. We talked about CRE in office space in particular, but there is a potential for an even greater downturn in office markets. And again, I'm not as concerned about the banks as I am concerned about non-banks that have a lot of exposure out there, but it's hidden. We don't know where it is. Price discovery in the office market has been difficult because there aren't a lot of transactions taking place. So we're not quite sure where the bottom is, those types of things. So I think those are the things that have me most concerned in early 2024.
Okay, well, two final questions. One, with a 7-year payback and a 12 cap in Midtown Atlanta, are you taking new clients? Because that's not a deal we see in Pittsburgh very often. And then just for fun, we do have the largest sporting event of the year coming up next weekend. So what are your predictions, 49ers or Chiefs?
I'm a Philadelphia guy, and I still like Andy Reid, so I'm going with the Chiefs.
Lamar Jackson is my neighbor, so he's a very good guy, and I went to the AFC Championship game yesterday, so I don't care.
Well, I hope you all found this as enjoyable as I did. I want to really ask you to join me in thanking our tremendous speakers. Thank you all for your support of NAIOP-Pittsburgh, of BOMA, our good partner here in the Burgh, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Hold on,